You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hold your ears, folks. It's showtime.
People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
Hey folks, welcome to a special episode of The Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. This is the rest of the interview that I did with Jim Bloom recently about his career. We talked a little bit specifically about Close Encounters of the Third Kind and The Empire Strikes Back. This is the rest of the story up until around 1980 or so. I hope you enjoy. Was the production associate job your first gig in the movie world?
So I was a student at UC Berkeley, and I was in my freshman year trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, as many 18 and 19-year-olds are at the time. My brother was going to school at Antioch College in Ohio, which had a really robust work-study program, and he also wanted to work on movies as well. And he had spent a summer, but one of the semesters working on Andromeda Strain. And he said to me once, we were talking, he said, "Why don't you make a movie?" And so he sent me his little 8mm Bolex camera. And in the spring semester of my freshman year, I made a short film with some other kids in a physics for non-majors class at Cal called Mr. Physics Meets the Frisbee. And it was just a little comedy about some obscure physics PhD doctorate who, decides that he's going to figure out how the Frisbee works and decides to invent one. And he goes out to Sproul Plaza where all the great Frisbee players used to be and, to show off his Frisbee. And he gets out there and he finds out that someone else has invented it. And so despondent, he walks toward the Campanile, which is sort of like the Venice Campanile on the Cal campus. It's one of the icons of the Cal campus. He go up the top to jump off and kill himself. And all along he's figuring out at what impact he'll hit the concrete and how fast he'll be going. That was all the physical stuff that was built into the movie, into this. And I sort of fell in love with the process. And then during my sophomore year at Cal, whenever I saw TV crews or documentary crews, I would always offer to help for free, which some people said get lost, and other times other people would say sure. And so I started, carrying cases and, camera equipment and lighting equipment and going off on these little small mini shoots, helping documentarians from all over the world who were shooting at Cal. And I started looking for work to see if this is something I wanted to do. I thought, well, let's try and find a job in the movie business. I got very lucky that I after many months, I wrangled a meeting with a director named John Cordy. I don't know if you know John. He directed The Diary of Jane Pittman and a few other features, and mostly a lot of TV movies of the week. One called Farewell to Manzanar, which was about the Japanese internment camps. It was made years later. It was made in summer of '75. I met John, and John said, "I haven't got anything for you," but he said, "There's this guy named George Lucas, and he's making a movie called American Graffiti this summer over in San Rafael. Why don't you call him?" So I went, "Okay." And I drove home and picked up the phone and called, and much to my shock, the woman who answered the phone was a woman named Bunny Alsop, who I worked with on Graffiti and Empire, and she then later worked for me when I was producing. And I said I was looking for work, and she said, "Oh, we're looking for somebody. Why don't you come over tomorrow and interview?" And I was like, "Okay." I was like shocked that they would say that. And I drove from Berkeley to San Rafael the next day, and I went into a meeting right away with Gary Kurtz and George, and they liked me. And I think I all said the magic words, which were, "I'll work for free," which fortunately, I was able to do that at the time. And I remember Gary saying, "Oh, well, that's okay. We'll pay you $10 a day." I said, no, you don't have to. He said, no, we'll pay you $10 a day. And I said, okay. And he said, great. Well, you start tomorrow. And my job on graffiti was I was responsible for all of the extra cars. So all of the background cars you see running up and down the street and, driving and pulling in and out and, filling up all, sort of the milieu of that moment, that was me. I had to find them and cast them and hire them. And, along with the daytime production group, they used to, help me with the, what time and where to show up for the cars because we were shooting nights. But every night I was up and down, running up and down the street, setting background action with all the cars. It was great. So it was the first feature I ever got to work on, which was just amazing. And that was really my start in the movie business. And I worked with a guy who was the second assistant director who, after graffiti, and because we both worked on graffiti, he went on to work on The Conversation, which was shot, we finished graffiti in August. I went off to Ohio to work on a documentary at Antioch with my brother, who was the cameraman, and another guy who was the director. Preschool children and the personalities that preschool teachers, Head Start teachers would be likely to encounter in a preschool group of 3 and 4 year olds. So we shot all these 3 and 4 year olds running around nursery school every morning, and it was really cute. It was fun. And after that, I came back, and the second AD became the first AD. And what was interesting is that Francis worked out a deal with the Directors Guild to start a company called the Directors Company. And it was a company that was Francis, Peter Bogdanovich, and Billy Friedkin. And as part of it, he was able to hire 2 assistant director trainees from the San Francisco Bay Area. And I got one of the spots. And the other spot went to another young guy named Randy Carter, who came out of ACT, who also had a really good career and, wound up being the first AD on Steinfeld for many years, years later. And so Randy and I were the 2 assistant director trainees. And what was sort of unique about it is that we didn't have to go through the traditional training program through the Directors Guild, which was back then you had to take a psychological aptitude test to see if you had the right psychological qualities to become a assistant director, and which was good because who knows if I would have ever passed that. They were looking for a particular kind of people back then. And so we went to work on The Conversation. So Randy and I were essentially, there was a first AD and we were really the 2 seconds, even though we were trainees. So that was my second feature. So it was like, right out of the bed. Yeah, really. It's like, work with George on one movie. And I knew who George was because I had seen THX and I knew what a talented guy he was. And I also, met Haskell Wexler, what a treat that was. And then worked on many other movies with him after that too. And worked on The Conversation. And then when The Conversation was over, my brother had gotten a job working with Bob Altman on a picture called Thieves Like Us, which was shooting down in Jackson, Mississippi. I don't know if you've ever seen Thieves. It was a really good movie. They needed another production assistant, and he got me a gig on the movie. And I flew down to Jackson, Mississippi, and spent, January, February, March, early April in Jackson, working on Thieves Like Us, working with the second AD and, doing PA work, everything from grip and electric to production to driving to all sorts of stuff. That was a great film because I got to work with Altman and see how he made movies. The movie business is very addictive, and it's particularly addictive to, people who may have some slight tendency toward, attention deficit disorder. Not that I did. I could always concentrate, but at the same time, what great fun to be 19, 20 years old. I mean, I was 19 when I got the job on graffiti. Then I turned 20 in September, and I was 20. I was working on The Conversation and working with Bob Altman, and it was like, wow, this is great fun. This is just, it's really exciting. It's interesting. It's, I really started to learn more about motion pictures and making movies and what went into all of it. And then when Thieves Like Us was over, I came back, and they were shooting the Streets of San Francisco TV show. And it was their second season. And I approached the production manager, who was a guy named Dick Gallagly, who I later hired to come work with me at ILM. And as always things are, it's like, you say this magic words, which is, hey, I'm local. Oh, I mean, in the back of his mind, as a good production manager would think, it was, well, we don't have to pay you, per diem and living expense. I don't have to put you up in a hotel room, and I can hire you and pay you an assistant director trainee work. And you've already worked on 3 features, so you've got some experience. It's not like you're green. So he said, great, you start next week and you're on full time. And I was just letting him know. I didn't, at the time, I didn't want to work on television. I just wanted to let him know I was available in case he needed some help on any given days, or, come in for 2 days or 3 days here or whatever. And he said, well, you're on full time. So I went to work on Streets, and the rationale behind it was, well, I'm a trainee, and at least, if nothing else, I can get through my days as a trainee to become eligible to work as a second assistant director. So I went to work on Streets for 2 seasons. I was there from season of 73, 74, and then again 74, 75. And when I'd finished the second season, we had worked on 46 episodes, and to work with Michael Douglas was a treat. But to work with Carl Malden, was something that became more apparent to me after I had begun to work with him, to better understand, who he was as an actor in the movie business, and all the different movies that he'd worked on, and all the different directors, and what a great talent he was. It was just, Carl was, a great character, and just a real treat. And I was also got to meet, a different director just about every week that we were working with, and worked with a lot of great actors as well. Carl was friendly with a lot of people, and Quinn Martin, who was the executive producer, who I only met once, but he had lots of, actors and actresses who would come up and do guest appearing roles. So, for example, I got to work with Sam Jaffe, who I had seen my whole life as Gunga Din, watching what was, WOR, the Channel 9 Saturday afternoon movie special, when Gunga Din would come on with Gregory Peck, and I forget the other actor's name, and Jaffe played Gunga Din. And when I meet Sam Jaffe, it was like, wow, this is amazing. And then another time I got to work with Ida Lupino, who, herself was a director, and, I knew who she was and had seen some of her movies, and that was a great treat. And worked with Nick Nolte when he was a very young actor, and other people like that. And at the time, Dick Donner, who later directed, all the Superman movies and other things like that, he came up and did a show. And what was funny about that is that he and I were talking, and he went out with my mother's sister when they were both in high school. They all grew up in New Rochelle together outside of New York City, and I mentioned it to her, and she said, oh, Dickie Donnenberg. He changed his name to Dick Donner. It used to be, different, but that was, I guess he became an actor, and that was his stage name before he became a director. So it was really a treat to do all that, and to sort of, very different than the feature business, because in TV you're knocking out, 20, 25 setups a day. It's really quick. You have to be very organized, very fast. And it was very interesting, experience for me early on. Between the first season and the second season, the woman who was Coppola's associate producer was a woman named Mona Skager, got a phone call from MGM and Sam Peckinpah's producer that Sam was coming to San Francisco to scout locations for a feature that he wanted to do. And she said, oh, call Jim Bloom. He'll take care of you. So I went, oh, okay. And I got a phone call. And all of a sudden, I'm scouting locations with Sam Peckinpah, showing him around San Francisco. And a lot of the places I took him worked out great. They all wound up in the movie. I showed him some really interesting places. And I don't know, have you ever seen the Killer Elite? The final scene takes place amongst these on a naval mothball fleet in Suisun Bay. And I took him up there and arranged to show him, the fleet, and he just sort of fell in love with it as a backdrop for, the final battle scene between I don't even remember the movie, the CIA guys and the ninjas, and, whatever the thrust of the movie was. It was all kind of very interesting. And so, but the funny thing about Sam is that Sam had an alcohol problem. And, our location scouting consisted of look at a location, go to a bar, look at a location, go to a bar, look at a location, stop at a bar. So by the end of the day, he was, pretty drunk. But Sam was, a pretty amazing character. And so, time went by. They finally got the picture launched. And, a year later that I got a phone call saying, we want you to come work on the movie. And so right after being a trainee, I got hired as a second on the Killer Elite, working. And it was my first Hollywood movie. And so that in itself is a real experience because I'd worked sort of on all these, more or less independent productions with great directors before that, shooting on location. And then all of a sudden, this very traditional Hollywood movie came up to San Francisco. And that in itself was a real eye-opener for me to kind of work on a studio picture, which I hadn't done before. And, just all that, it's a whole kind of different set of personalities and people and egos. And, it's just very interesting. So we shot in San Francisco for, I remember, 8 or 9 weeks. And then we went down and shot on at MGM, which is now Sony Pictures, but it was the old MGM studio in Culver City. And I'd never shot on a lot before. So that was like, wow, this is what making movies on the sound stages is all about. And we shot down there for, 3 or 4 weeks. So that was really quite something. And then I'm trying to remember the chronology here. And I think after that, and John Cordy was doing Farewell to Manzanar, which was a TV movie of the week that I worked on as the second AD. And then following that, I got a phone call to come work with Hal Ashby on Bound for Glory as a second, which Bound for Glory was a big picture, lots of people, moving parts, period stuff, big movie, trains, all sorts of stuff like that. And worked on that for a while. Didn't go with them to LA, but stopped. And then after that, got a call to go work on Close Encounters, where I met Stephen. And all along through this time, I had kept in touch with George and Gary, just to touch bases and say hello or come meet them and have lunch or whatever. And on Close Encounters, which is sort of interesting, Close Encounters is such a big movie. And the personalities were so, again, kind of big just among the production crew that the first AD, who was this guy named Chuck Myers, who I'd worked with on Graffiti and then again on The Conversation and then on Bound for Glory. He was the first on The Conversation and Bound for Glory. He became the first on Close Encounters and asked me to come with him as the key second. And Close Encounters is just a huge movie. We started in Gillette, Wyoming, and then went to Mobile, Alabama. And Mobile was, Mobile in the summertime. It was just hard, 90 degrees, 90% humidity, just an awful sort of working environment to be doing exteriors or interiors with all the heat or, shooting in the dirigible hangar where we shot. Just a really tough experience. And that was really my first exposure to visual effects because Doug Trumbull had brought the motion control equipment machine, was doing all the visual effects for Close Encounters. So I got to work with him and I learned about making movies and visual effects. While we were shooting, it was a very complicated shoot at times because of the continuity of the movie, the way it had to be photographed, not necessarily in continuity order, but more in visual effects orders from starting wide, and then going wide, less wide, medium, tight, close. And so there was a lot of, matching going on because every day we were working with anywhere from 50 to 150 extras all running around this box canyon with spaceships landing and, ETs walking off the mothership and the lighting cues and all this sort of thing. And there were also some funny personalities between Vilmos, who's the director of photography, and his gaffer, who was brought on by the studio. We had every light that was available in Hollywood down in Alabama with us. And none of the other pictures could get arcs because we had them all. And we had arcs and HMIs, and it was just a huge production effort. And Vilmos and the gaffer, a guy named Earl Gilbert, didn't get along. And being around camera when you were setting stuff up with Stephen and Vilmos was like a little cantankerous. And I tend to be a pretty diplomatic fellow. And Chuck was a little less patient than I was with all these. And he finally said, he said, Bloom, you take care of this. You call the roll and I'll take care of all the other stuff, which was fine because some of the background stuff was very complicated, and, it was almost easier for me to do that. And in doing that, I sort of became the first AD on the movie in a way, because I was always next to camera coordinating stuff. And while we were shooting, George came down to visit Steven, so he got to see me working in that capacity. And that was in 76. So it was nice to see George again. And then after Close, it's been so long, I'm going to forget everything. Close Encounters, and then went back to work on Coming Home and got to work with Hal Ashby again, which was Hal's a great director and a really lovely human being, just a great person. Sometimes in movie making, you find great directors who, as people, okay. And other times you find great directors who are also really good people, big hearts, genuine, empathetic individuals. And Hal was one of those guys. So it was a treat to work with him. And not only that, the subject matter was kind of perfect, for this kid from Berkeley, which I was, to go work on that Vietnam War type movie, and to work with Jane Fonda and John Voight and, Bruce Dern. It was just like, wow, what a treat. What a, good movie. And it was a small, intimate story, and working in the hospital with all these ex-Vietnam War vets. It was 1977 when we made the picture. And then after that, I had then become eligible to become a first AD. I didn't think it would happen right away, because it rarely does. I was only 24. And I got a phone call from Matthew Robbins and Hal Barwood, who I had met on Close Encounters. And Matthew and Hal were very successful screenwriters. And they had written, Bingo Long and the Traveling All-Stars and MacArthur and Sugarland Express. And, they were very hot and up-and-coming team. And they wrote a script called Corvette Summer that they set up at MGM. And Matthew needed a first AD, and he called me and he said, would you be my first assistant? And it was like, sure. It's like, how could I say no? It was like, to get a jump from second to first at age 24 is, I think I was one of the youngest first ADs, at the time, if not, probably not ever, but, at the time. And so I went to work on Corvette Summer and got to work with Mark Hamill, I hadn't worked with Mark before then, but he had just finished Star Wars. And so worked with Mark on Corvette Summer. And after Corvette Summer, Phil Kaufman asked me to come work with him on Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So I did that, which was great. And, again, Phil's another one of these, great guys, great director, and really a lovely human being. It was one of the nicest movie experiences I think I ever had, working with Phil, just because of his style in working. And it was a great shoot. And again, a really fun movie, well suited to my sensibilities, about pods taking over the real people. It was, back in the end of the Nixon era, or, between Nixon, Carter, and Reagan period, or Ford. Anyway, I'm getting my presidents mixed up, but fit my sensibility very well. And then as Body Snatcher was over, Gary Kurtz called and said, because I'd kept up with all of them, Gary said, I want you to come work for me as my assistant on The Empire Strikes Back. And I was like, okay, Well, it was interesting. I said to him, Gary, I really would like to try and become a director and stop working in production. And he said, well, this will only help you be a better director if you come work for me. And I thought about it and I went, yep, you're right. And so I went to work and I was hired as the assistant producer. And my initial job was to move ILM, Van Nuys, up to San Francisco and turn it into a permanent facility. And so I spent months doing that and hiring, all the guys, all the names of, these famous visual effects artists. And I knew a little bit about visual effects from my work on Close Encounters, so it wasn't completely new to me. And so I set up ILM. Gary wanted me to come over to London, in particular to help run the Norwegian unit. And so I hired a guy named Dick Gallagly, who I'd worked with on the streets of San Francisco, who was the production manager, to come run ILM. And Dick came in and he sort of took over when I went to London in like November of, 78. Shooting began in Norway in February 79. And I was with the Norwegian unit, which was supposed to be 3 weeks that turned into 9 weeks up on the glacier in Finse. First with the first unit and then with the second unit, making sure that we got all of the work that we needed, for that particular sequence. And then, but, before that, I was able to, hire and, bring, all these great visual effects guys in, like, Richard Edlund and Dennis Murin and Ken Ralston and, all these guys who, later became, the big names in the visual effects industry, and turn ILM into this great ongoing facility, and got to work with Joe Johnston and lots of other people as well. I think with Brian Johnson, who came over, and it was just a great opportunity. All these great guys working at ILM at the time, because I think Empire is my favorite movie of all of the Star Wars movies. And, getting to work with Kirshner and everyone else. Let me backstep with you. On Corvette Summer, Matthew called me to work as the first AD, and I had met Matthew because he and Hal did some uncredited script work on Close Encounters. And I first met them when they were doing that work. And then later they were down in Mobile, Alabama, because they were both the first two to walk off the mothership on camera. They were the two lost World War II bomber pilots who got kidnapped by the aliens, and they were the first two who wandered off. So I got to meet them then, and I guess that was when Matthew got to see me working as an assistant director, and probably helped him decide that Jim might be a good first AD for me to come work on Corvette Summer. So that's where and to this day, I'm still very friendly with both of them. I live in Point Reyes Station. We moved out here about a year ago, and in Inverness, which is 10 minutes away, is where Matthew lives. And I still talk to him every couple of weeks. And, I don't see him as much now as I'd like to because of the pandemic, but we used to see each other all the time. I've been, been good friends for a long, long time, and I tried to produce some movies that Matthew wanted to direct. And it's kind of a small circle of film people up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we all know each other pretty well. Anyway, so I worked on Empire, and then when Norway was over, Gary was not happy with the way things were going back at ILM. So he said, I want you to go home and go run ILM. So I went back to ILM and went in to help with Dick. And after I was there for a while, Dick said, I'm not enjoying this. I'm a live action guy, not a visual effects guy. I don't know how to, this is not my thing. So I'm going to take off. So I just sort of stepped in and took over. We sort of finished up Empire. It was a huge, huge effort, but we were able to do it. Toward the end of the production, Gary came to me and said, I'd like to offer you an associate producer credit. And I went, oh, and the other associate producer was a guy named Robert Watts, who had worked on Star Wars, who had become a close friend of mine. And I said, well, if it's okay with Robert, I'd be happy to do it. I didn't want to tread on his toes. And Robert said yes. And so my title changed from assistant producer to associate producer. So I was in charge of all of the post-production, ILM, post-production sound, everything, post-production editorial, it all sort of flowed through me and my office. And I was, again, I was very, I was 1980, I was 27, turning 28, 27 in 80 when the picture came out in May of 80, I think. Yeah, that's about right. So I was still a young guy. And when that was over, I stayed on and then went to work on Jedi and became a co-producer on Jedi. After Jedi, Hal and Matthew went to go do a picture called The Grid that we never made, but it was a great time travel movie. A lot of the elements of which showed up in the first Terminator, which was really interesting because it was about people from the future coming back to our present, to solve a problem before they go back to the future again. And so there were a lot of the qualities of the Terminator that kind of showed up. It would still make a great movie, and I still joke with Hal and Matthew that, let's go out and set it up again. Because it was just a great story about, four characters who come from the future to the present. But like you make a wrong turn on the freeway, so you wind up here and somebody else winds up there. In time travel, when something goes slightly awry, one person came down in 1955 and somebody else came down in 1965 and somebody else came down in 75, and then the last person came down in 1980. And it's all about these three characters trying to get themselves back together to figure out how to get back to the future, where they all had their lives. So it's really a great script. One of the magazines, forgetting, maybe it was Cinefantastique, could have been it, did a whole article, a whole issue on the grid. And we hired to work on it Ralph McQuarrie and Sid Mead and another guy named Peter Lorre. We had the most unbelievable concept work that was done for what the props and the vehicles and the future looked like. It was just like eye-popping. But the production company was the Ladd Company, and they had just made The Right Stuff. And when it came out, it did really poorly, and they ran out of money. And we had to find a partner because they couldn't afford the whole ticket, which was like $14 million at the time. This is 1983, 84, and 83, 84, and 14 million was too rich for them. And so we went looking for other partners, and it's like your classic producing story of what to and what not to do as a producer that you learn along the way. And I was, this would have been my first movie as a producer, per se, sole producer. And Spielberg loved the movie, and he took it to Universal and said, "You should go make this movie." And we brought it to Universal, and we had meetings with Lou Wasserman and Sid Sheinberg about partnering with Laddie to make the picture. And I think maybe the budget at that point was like $16 million, because there were a lot of visual effects in it and stuff that had never been done before. But we had all this great concept art and a great script, and we were interviewing all these great actors to be in it, like, Mel Gibson and Ed Harris and Michelle Pfeiffer and Glenn Close. And, they were all sort of, back then, they were all starting their careers, and just beginning to break out, and had, interest from quite a few of them about working in the movie. But true to form, Universal was like, well, we can't do it for 16, but if you can get the budget down to 14, we'll do it. It's like, if I knew then what I knew now, I would have said, okay, we'll do it. I should have just learned the lessons that I had learned earlier in my career, about sometimes at the studio, or what I also learned later in my career when I went to work at the studio, which is that, a studio will say 14, the budget's 16, and they'll go to their financing people and they're going to put in 18 to 20 to cover themselves to make the movie. But I said no. And so we never made the film, unfortunately. We went to other places and other people. We went to HBO because they were just starting up and they weren't interested. And so we didn't get the picture made. But after that, Hal had written a script called Warning Sign, which is a really good movie. And I don't know if you've seen it lately or seen it at all. But it's very pandemic related because it's all about a accident in a gene splicing laboratory in rural Utah, where the local community thinks you're involved in agrigenetics, but they're actually in one lab doing germ warfare. And the bug gets out and people start to get sick. And they close the lab because they don't have an antidote. And the people on the outside don't know what they're doing, but are trying to break in to rescue all their loved ones. And then the people on the inside are getting sick, and the ones who aren't getting sick are trying to break out. And the government shows up, and they can't. They need to let the disease run its course, because otherwise, if the disease gets out, the whole world will get infected. And the idea behind this genetically engineered disease was that it infects the rage center of the brain, so that your enemy kills themselves. You don't have to kill them. That was the thrust behind it. And it's a real rocket ride. It's a good movie. And it was with Sam Waterston and Kathleen Quinlan and Yaphet Kotto and Richard Dysart and Jeffrey DeMunn. Dean Cundy was the director of photography. Henry Bumstead was the production designer who had done Hitchcock movies and George Roy Hill movies and was a great production. My effort as the producer was to surround a first-time director with great technical help to, make the picture look great. And so Bumstead, his nickname is Bummy, and also worked with Clint Eastwood, was the designer. The editor was a guy named Bob Lawrence, who'd won an Academy Award working with Kubrick on Spartacus. We had this great technical team. Alan Splett was the sound designer, who won an Academy Award for Amadeus. And the soundtrack is just fantastic. It's just, you watch the movie now, you can buy it or rent it on Amazon. And, watch it in the dark and turn up the sound. And the soundtrack is like, whoa, it's like really eerie and spooky. And, the film has its faults, unfortunately, but we got caught between a regime change at 20th Century Fox, who had greenlit the picture. And the president of Fox at the time was a guy named Joe Wazan. And like 2 weeks before we went into principal photography, he was fired. And he was replaced by Larry Gordon. And soon after Larry left, Barry Diller came in with Scott Rudin and another producer whose name I'm forgetting at the moment. But they sort of took over the studio. And we became an orphan child. We became a liability. When studios change regimes and you've got a film in the middle of production, it doesn't serve a new regime well to put their money and efforts behind someone else's picture, because there's far more downside than there is upside. It's much easier to say, not my movie, and just let it go and spend no money marketing it. That's essentially what happened. We came out a year later. They spent, less than $1 million on advertising and marketing. And the picture opened in what at the time were called the Dog Days of August, like on August 8th. In like very few cities. And the movie didn't do well. We got a very good review from Richard Schickel at Time Magazine. He really liked it. But the movie sort of came and died because nobody heard about it. But people see it now, and it actually has pretty good, I hear it has pretty good reviews on Amazon. And a group did a DVD re-release. I forget their name, out of Portland, Oregon, just last year, or a few years ago, in 2019, they did a re-release of the movie on DVD, and I think it's doing pretty well. And then when the pandemic hit, I tried to get the folks at Amazon interested in it again, to see if they could do something, because it was not, it was very similar to 28 Days Later and that's Soderbergh movie about Contagion. Yeah, and had they put a little press behind it, I'm sure a lot of people would have watched it, because it was particularly pandemic related. All about, unfortunately about a disease, but just like turn on the news. And the thing that was interesting is that we made the movie in 85, and it was all about gene engineering. And at the time, everybody was talking about that the pandemic was, it was a secret lab in Wuhan, China, that the bug got out, and they were dealing with, and this is exactly what the movie was about. Exactly. But we had made it 35 years earlier, and it's a pretty good looking film. It's a lot of fun, but Hal did a really good job. It's like, sit down, put your seatbelt on, and away you go. The movie, you're not wasting time anywhere. And Kathleen Quinlan delivered a wonderful performance. She was just great as the heroine in distress. And Sam Waterston, plays this, slightly nerdy, intelligent, small town cop who wants to become a lawyer. And Yaphet Kotto is the government guy, comes in to like cordon off the building and let everybody die inside. People say, "Oh, I saw that movie. I really loved it." It's like, "Oh, you and my mother." Nobody, when it came out, few people saw it, but it really is. I watched it again, years later, and I really, really enjoyed seeing it again. I thought Hal did a good job, and it's unfortunate the movie didn't get a bigger place. I mean, some of it's a little, and it was also one of the first zombie movies as well, because that's what happened, is that these people get infected and they get sick, they fall asleep. You think they're dead, and they wake up and they're like, they're kind of, they become zombie-ish, going around, killing everybody. So it was pretty wild. And then after that, I tried to get a few pictures made as a producer, which is, hard to do. Worked with lots of different directors on different things. I worked with Warren Beatty on Dick Tracy for a while. I worked with George Miller, the Australian George Miller, trying to get something. He wanted me to work on Witches of Eastwick with him, but that didn't quite work out. They hired the president of the studio's brother to produce that instead of me, which is those are the ways of Hollywood. And worked with Volker Schlondorf, who was a great director, who did The Tin Drum, a picture that we unfortunately, a lot of movie making is you go out and you work on stuff that never quite makes it to the screen. But working with Volker was a great treat. I mean, he was what an artist he was. The Tin Drum is just a wonderful movie. But it was a tough picture because it was about an apostate from the Mormon Church, that gets killed, because he sort of takes up arms and, takes his family as hostage when they're trying to come after him. And I didn't quite make that. Then I worked on a movie with Gillian Armstrong called Fires Within, and it was quite a good movie, and very interesting, with Jimmy Smits and Greta Scacchi, and I'm going to forget the name of Vincent D'Onofrio. What a great actor Vincent D'Onofrio is, and a really interesting triangular love story, but very kind of anti-Castro, which at the time in the early 90s was not quite the sentiment. It was the sentiment was more pro-Castro, except in Miami, except in Little Havana, where it was still anti-Castro. But that's where this movie was written by a woman named Cynthia Cedre, who was a Cuban immigrant, and she was telling a story from a different point of view. It was interesting. All of the in Havana, we were called Los Gusanos, which I think is the ants, the insects. I forget exactly the exact term. But they didn't hold us in a very high regard, for having worked on this, sort of what they considered to be anti-Castro type movie. But I mean, hey, it was a good movie, and Jill was, really quite a good director, out of Australia, and had done quite a few movies, and really quite good with her cast. And after that, I went to work I got hired at Sony Pictures for a few years to run two, what they called new technology divisions. The first was IMAX 3D movies. This is back in the early 90s. And then the other one was interactive movies. This was years ahead of all of these things that were happening. Sony was starting a new kind of urban retail motion picture building environment. And to anchor the retail and the theaters, there was the Metroplexes. There's one at Lincoln Center. It's probably still there in New York City. There was one in San Francisco called the Metreon. And the idea behind it for Sony was to anchor them with 3D theaters and do 3D movies that they could run during the daytime in IMAX 3D, which was just beginning to take off as a production format, where you wore these great IMAX 3D goggles that had sound built into them. And so you'd not only have 3D picture, but you'd have 3D sound, and you worked with these dinosaur 3D cameras that IMAX had built with split mirror lens, two cameras shooting at the same time, through a split mirror. And the sound was great because when you put these headphones on it, you could, one of the things that they did was one of the tests was they gave you a haircut, and you could hear the of the scissors going around the back of your head from your right ear to your left ear. So it was like, okay, well, how do they advance the movie-going experience? It's not only amazing 3D picture, but also at the same time 3D sound as well. And so Peter Gruber had set this up, and it was part of Mickey Schulhoff, who was running Sony at the time, was one of his endeavors to do all this. And they were looking for all of these new experiences to bring into these retail spaces along with the theaters. which like Microsoft had a space and they were doing gaming stuff and trying to come up with new stuff to take advantage of the new computer technology that was becoming available from gaming and ride film and other things of this nature. And so I moved back to LA for a while, and we worked with a group out of New York called Interfilm. And they had made a movie at Interfilm. Anyway, it was the interactive movie stuff was done on Laserdisc. And they came up with this technique of putting sort of hand sticks, outfitting small theaters with hand sticks with a 3-choice button. It was like, red, green, and blue, or red, yellow, and blue or something. And it was interactive storytelling. So you would watch a movie and then the audience, you'd come to an arterial branch and the audience would get to vote. And would you want it to go left, right, or center? Which story did you want to follow? And Bijan, a guy named Bob Bijan, came up with this. A very bright guy, more of a technologist than a filmmaker. Came up with this. He launched a first movie that they showed at some of the theaters. I think it was at the Bicycle Messenger, something like that. But it was interesting because it changed the movie theater environment, and it changed it from be quiet or watching a movie to more of a sporting type thing. Because when it came to people voting, they got vocal about which way to go. So from an interactive storytelling, of which there was, I read a lot about this a few years ago, and it never took off because I don't think people are really interested in it. People are more interested in, linear storytelling, and it's kind of complicated to tell a multilinear story because they tend to be kind of arterial, like a tree. You're always branching off, from the tree itself, but you always have to come back in again to move the story forward, because otherwise you're like, a half-hour movie, you're generating, 4 hours of material. So it wasn't particularly satisfying, but kids liked it. And kids liked it in a, kind of a Saturday matinee type environment back then. And we made a couple other movies. I brought in Bob Gale, who was Bob Zemeckis' writing and producing partner on the Back to the Future movies. And Bob came up with a story called I'm Your Man, which was all about a revenge type story, which was sort of interesting. It's like, somebody done me wrong, so you go see this guy. And I may be getting my titles mixed up, but anyway, and Bob did something. But on the IMAX 3D movies, we worked with Jean-Jacques Annaud, who had done The Bear and Quest for Fire, and there was always this kind of director who was always interested in pushing the storytelling and technology forward. And he came up with an idea which was great. I spent a lot of time with Jean-Jacques talking about all this, and he had made a movie called, I think it's called Aeropostale, but it was about the early days of the airmail service in South America. And it was back when Saint-Exupéry was a flyer. He was he had written The Little Prince, and he was a pilot, and they used to fly across the Andes from Santiago, Chile to Buenos Aires. And this was the story of one of the pilots who went down, in these old prop planes. He took off from Santiago, flying the mail to Buenos Aires. And in the middle of the Andes, his plane went down and he had to walk out, and still delivered the mail. It's one of those stories. But so it's like, so why is this a good movie for IMAX 3D? Well, because you're flying, first of all, which is an amazing experience in IMAX 3D. To be flying in a plane over mountaintops is just remarkable. And the other part is that once you sort of crash, you're in this incredible natural environment of mountaintops and peaks and valleys. And it's a great survival story in 3D, showing somebody like walking out of the Andes back to civilization and to his wife and her, and his life again. So it was tried to combine all of these elements that would work for visual storytelling, oral, like AUR, oral storytelling with sound, with wind and airplane noise and stuff like that. And, and then the human element, which is somebody having to, get themselves out of this situation and back to their wife, who they think about constantly while they're, trying to trudge out of the mountains. It's a true story, and it was really an amazing effort that this man made. And it's good. I don't know if you could ever see it again in 3D. I don't, who knows? Maybe IMAX has still got the prints, but it was a double projection system, but a really good movie.
I went to New York City for the first time in 1995, and I went to the Sony Theater at Lincoln Center and saw that film. Yeah, that was amazing.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, cool. Well, then there you go. That was the movie that I, helped get, made and produced. And, it was interesting. I remember being at Sony and being an executive at the time. And I remember, it was like, do we make this movie? Do we not make this movie? What should we do? What should we do? And I said to myself, it's like, what the fuck am I doing here? If I'm here to make a movie, go make a movie. Let's just go do it. Let's just do it. It's like, why not? I mean, there are all these other studio executives trying to get pictures made, and nobody was making movies at the time. And, I remember, being, sitting in production meetings, trying to get the movie greenlit. And I remember, Peter Guber playing like the devil's advocate against me. About, well, what can we make this movie for? We're just going to go out and waste $14 million, and who's going to see it? And he was testing me. He was testing me as the studio executive to inspire him with my enthusiasm for why we should go make this movie. I remember those meetings, specifically. So I had to, get him. And he was excited about making the movie. He wanted to see if I was as excited as he was to get the film made, and we were. You remember, it was like Elizabeth McGovern and Val Kilmer, and another young actor who never went on. Hey, there you go, you got it. It was Craig Sheffer. Anyway, the movie went into production, and then it went into post. But at that time, my wife and I decided that we weren't crazy about being in LA. Yeah, you need life decisions that we make along the way in our careers, and I got an offer from Electronic Arts to go work for them and help them go into the interactive movie business, which, in retrospect turned out to be a huge mistake. And so I left the movie business for a while, and I went to work in the video game business, which I shouldn't have done, because my heart was in making movies, not in video. I never liked video games, but I thought it was an opportunity, and they were talking about a new startup, and, video games were all the rage at the moment. It was a chance to move back up to the Bay Area again and get out of LA, and et cetera, et cetera. And I left. And then a couple of years later, both of those divisions that I had helped start, fell apart, and nothing ever happened with them. They made one other 3D movie. I don't know if you ever saw what was the second one called? It was actually a lovely movie. A director named Steve Lowe made for them. It was about a stowaway on a boat from Russia, young kid who escapes Russia and comes to New York to find his family who had immigrated like 30, 40 years earlier. And what was kind of nice about it was that it got to show New York, and it was supposedly an anchor piece for that New York theater. And also talked to, American Story, talking about immigration. But the pretty thing about it was the conceit was that he has an ocarina, and he remembers this tune that had always been in the family for 30 years. Lovely tune that he could play on the ocarina. And as he lands in New York and, the stowaway, and with some help from some of the sailors, gets off the boat and makes his way into New York City and starts trying to find his way to wherever and all he has, this was the nice thing about the movie, all he has is these old 3D stills were all the rage back at the turn of the century. And all he has are these 3D stills and a little sort of handheld 3D, viewer that when you, put the two matched slides in and you look at it through the viewer, you get to see a 3D image. And so he's got images of New York from like the 19-teens of what it looked like then. And that's how he's trying to navigate his way toward where his family's supposed to be. And people are like, well, I don't recognize this, but other people are saying, oh yeah, go here, go here, as he gets closer and closer. And as he's finally on the street, which is almost unrecognizable from the slides, he hears the music, his family song playing, and he knows that he's reconnected with his family. So, these movies were only like 20, 25 minutes long, but, it was really I thought it was a nice story, but it didn't do particularly well. I think it did okay. But anyway, both of those businesses didn't quite, there wasn't, the interactive movie, they could have tried to do something, but they didn't really want to put a lot of, sink a lot of money into it, put a lot of effort into trying to make it work. They needed a champion, and they didn't really have one to try and make it happen. And it was kind of a difficult business, looking back on it, you kind of figure out ways how you could have made it happen. But anyway, I left and I went to Electronic Arts. I stayed there for, a little while, then left with one of the big executives from EA to start another startup in the video game business, and stayed with him for a couple of years, and venture capital backed, and they ran out of patience where we were trying to do some new and interesting stuff. And they kind of ran out of patience on doing it. And then I left there. And a few years after that, I went to work at Tippett Studio and helping run Tippett Studio, because I had known Phil from Empire and Jedi. And they wanted to grow the studio and stabilize the work that they were doing. And for me, it was a good opportunity because it was in Berkeley where I was living, and my son was, in elementary and junior high school. A good timing for me to be at home as opposed to living the peripatetic lifestyle of a, movie producer traveling around the globe. I didn't, had been there, done that. No, thank you. Let's be at home for a while and, help my wife raise a family. So did that and stayed there for a while, and then left. And a few years ago, produced another low budget movie that we did in San Francisco called Pushing Dead, which was $1 million production about a man in his late 30s, early 40s with AIDS, learning how to kind of adjust to living with AIDS, and, kind of a dark comedy. It was sort of a fun movie. First time director named Tom Brown, and we had Danny Glover was in it, and a few other people, lesser actors. Names I'm sort of forgetting at the moment, but never had much of a theatrical release, and it's available now on Amazon. It's not a bad movie, but it was okay. And now I'm kind of retired, as I move into my late 60s.
You spent so much time in those early days working in San Francisco only to come back to it. I love it.
Never, would always go to LA to work from time to time. And be there for, a year and a half, 6 months, 3 months, whatever, over the time. And, I was very, familiar with LA, but it was where I wanted to be and, raise a family, spend my life. LA just never did much for me. Just didn't care to live down there. But my brother was there. My mom and dad moved out and lived down there. They all wanted me to stay and be down there, but I couldn't find any kind of spiritual sustenance living down there. And then, what happens is that when you're in LA, and if you don't live in LA and you're working, people in LA kind of resent that you don't live there. It's like, well, I have to live here. Why don't you have to live here? There's a little bit of that, that kind of quality about it. So, those things happen. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting career filled with all sorts of stories and stuff.